course, it was a lot of news this week. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we were crazed about the AI thing, right? And now this week had as much news as it did last week, right? And so everyone said, well, this is the beginning of a trade war. But as Trump said, the most beautiful word is tariff, right? And so we certainly got a lot of that information this week.
We did, and I can't comment on the aesthetics of the word itself, right? I always have to use the little spell check. I'm like, are there two R's and two S's or
Thank
what?
You know, I thought I was the only one.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I've been studying this stuff for decades, you know. But last week, Saturday, I was at dinner with my parents, and I was checking my phone, the White House website, to see what the text of the executive order actually was. And it did eventually roll out where President Trump, he did have the announcement applying tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and China. Now, Mexico and Canada, they did have the discussion, and the tariffs are put on ice until about March 1st. And as
put on ice, let's be careful with that.
That's right. A little bit deliberate wordplay there,
Okay.
right? Because it is about using tariffs as a tool for immigration and for the flow of drugs into the United States, right? But with China, those tariffs did go into effect, so that has not been put on in abeyance. And we do have the 10% tariffs on China, and that one isn't about immigration, but it is about the flow of drugs. And I think that's kind of a key thing here, is that tariffs are being used as a tool to accomplish those goals of dealing with immigration and the flow of drugs. So
and that's what I've said all week long, right, as we did a lot of media, you and I. But he's using an economic tool to achieve a non-economic goal.
Yep.
And so we'll see if it works out. But it certainly looks like China retaliated, at least in a minor way, right?
Yeah.
To me, that looks like that's just a little bit of negotiation with the guy who wrote The Art of the Deal, right? So they're putting a bunch of stuff on the table, perhaps to take it off.
That's right. And the tariffs that China put on in retaliation were very targeted and very measured. So ours is a blanket tariff on anything coming from China, whereas for them it's targeting like liquefied natural gas, coal, you have large agricultural equipment, then also there's some investigation into specific companies as far as anti-competitive practices. So much more targeted than what the United States did. And President Trump and President Xi, they still need to have that talk. They're going to have a discussion at some point, and maybe those tariffs can be removed. But the market certainly did react to it. When I was looking at the foreign exchange market, the Mexican peso and Canadian dollar, those depreciated, went down in value pretty significantly when the tariffs were announced. But then they rallied hard, and they appreciated when President Trump announced that there was going to be that postponement of the implementation of them because they did come to some sort of agreement.
And you know all of this tariff talk, and I know you're a PhD in economics, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when Ben Stein was in that class. And remember, he started off with Bueller.
That's right.
And then he started talking about the Smoot-Hawley Act that put everyone to sleep. But anyone?
That's
Do you
right.
recall that, Professor? That's what he was talking about. He was talking about the trade war.
Absolutely. And a lot of people sort of mix up as far as what did the Smoot-Hawley Trade Act actually do in terms of the Depression. It didn't make it better, but it didn't cause it. I would say
it didn't cause it. And this is what I hate to debate with you, but the economic background was totally different in 1929 and 1930, right? Yep. The Fed was making mistakes. Interest rates were higher.
Big time.
Now the background is totally different. Unemployment is low. Interest rates are relatively low. I mean, the GDP is positive. So the economic background is totally different today than it was in 1930.
That is absolutely correct. So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, those went into effect after the Depression was already really snowballing. And a lot of economists, not all of them because there can be disagreement, it was about monetary policy really being offsides that caused or contributed to the Great Depression. And so what we're having now, some people are saying, oh, this is going to be just like the 1930s. And so as a result, the economy is going to go in the tank and we're going to have all sorts of problems with the markets. Well, slow down a little bit, right? Because let's see how this plays out. You always talk about let's look at the facts and circumstances and monitor how those change. And I think that's really what we need to do here.
And I totally agree with that. And the Fed, of course, they did guess a little bit and said they didn't want to lower interest rates. We're going to come back to that, but because of the anticipation of tariffs. And one of our partners that gives us economic advice is suggesting that there will be a global tariff, that
Sure.
that is going to come, and Trump wants to use that as a revenue source. There's a bit of a debate there, right? Because can you take revenue from a tariff that is not really part of the tax plan? I mean, it's got to be part of the plan to do that, and it's not legislated.
Sure. Well, and that's where it gets into the politics versus the economics of it, right? So that's a political issue. How do they account for it? If we get these blanket tariffs and politically they can't count it, they can't score it as a revenue source.
Right. So because if they go away, if he says, okay, the tariffs are off tomorrow, but they just scored this tax plan, that is not going to square.
That's right. But I think that from a market's perspective and economically, we would look at it as they're getting the revenue, right? I don't care if it was part of this deal or not, but it does mean, will these tariffs then go away if he changes his mind or after we get a new administration, because he does only have this one term left?
And one more thing I do want to get out there to kind of separate fact from opinion, because everyone, it depends on what political side you're on, is making opinions on what can happen. But there's something that is a fact, and that is that there are trade imbalances today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, some of those come as a result of classic economics, comparative advantage. We don't grow a lot of coffee in the United States. I mean, in Hawaii they do. But, if all of a sudden we have tariffs on Colombia, right, what does that do to the price of coffee? But a lot of countries, they have very different trade policies that can lead to trade imbalances. And I think that's really what President Trump wants to address. It's not the trade balance itself, it's what's the cause of it? Is it some policy that is disadvantaging U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers? It's not just tariffs. A lot of times it's what are called non-tariff trade barriers. So it could be industrial policies. It could be about, quality issues in terms of, quality standards. So lots of issues. And I think it's going to be interesting as this discussion goes on, because it will play out over time, is when those things come to light, how people then begin feeling about the threat of tariffs.